The goal of this video is to show you safely and correctly how to make a repair on any cabinet produced with R-290 refrigerant. The first thing to consider is how do I identify the cabinet I'm working on uses R-290 refrigerant. All R-290 equipment is required to have special labeling throughout the cabinet. Besides the serial tag label, you will see several labels on the cabinet interior and the back of the cabinet. Additionally, the condensing unit will also have several labels on it. It is also required that all R-290 equipment have red sleeves over the refrigerant line process tubes. Now that you properly identified the cabinet as using R-290 refrigerant, also be aware that the cabinet was manufactured to meet specific UL guidelines and standards that pertain to R-290 refrigerant. Because of this, True requires any part used for the repair to be an OEM part. For any reason you receive a replacement part that is not exactly the same as the part you are replacing, stop and call True before continuing. All the fan motors have a sealed shaft. All the relay and temperature controls have sealed contacts. The wire connectors that we use require a certain amount of force to pull the wires out of the connectors, which eliminates any spark potential. Wire nuts and crimp type connectors do not meet this requirement. Therefore, they should never be used in any R-290 cabinet. For all refrigeration repairs, you are still required to follow good refrigeration practices. Standard refrigeration tools will still be required, including oxygen-free dry nitrogen, a micron gauge, and shutoff valve for your charging hose. In addition to these tools, you should also use as short of a refrigerant hoses as possible, as well as a pinch-off tool. Now let's focus on the additional specialized tools that will be required for R-290 service. You will need a combustible gas leak detector, the safety placard. Use only R-290 refrigerant. If you're using the 1-pound cylinder supplied by True, you will also need to use the specialized charging valve. These are the only specialized tools needed to service an R-290 system. True offers these parts individually or as part of several types of R-290 repair kits. Please contact True's parts department for pricing and availability. The following procedures should be followed when doing any type of refrigeration repair. True requires the following good refrigeration practices. These practices should include, but are not limited to, not leaving the refrigeration system open to the atmosphere for more than 15 minutes. Always change the dryer whenever the refrigeration system has been opened. Use a micron gauge and pull a vacuum to a minimum of 500 microns. The introduction to the refrigeration system of anything other than a flushing agent, nitrogen, R-290, or refrigerant oil is prohibited. All refrigeration repairs should be made in a well-ventilated area. The repair we are going to show is replacing a condensing unit on an R-290 system that was previously diagnosed with a locked-up compressor. Our R-290 repair starts with the service technician turning on his combustible gas leak detector and leaving it on throughout the unit repair. When you turn on the combustible gas leak detector, it will have to self-calibrate. This will take about a minute. Once the high-pitched beeping levels off, you can continue. Do not proceed with the repair until the meter levels off. Put on your safety glasses. The technician should then display the safety placard in the area he will be making the repair in. Disconnect the unit you're repairing from any power source. The service technician will then need to install temporary piercing valves to allow access to the refrigeration system. To do this, you may need to trim a portion of the required red identifying sleeves back and place the temporary valves as close to the crimp on the end of the process tube as possible. The combustible gas leak detector may go off during this process. Once the high-pitched beeping levels off, you can proceed. After the temporary valves have been placed on the suction and discharge process tubes on an R-290 system, the technician will have to install his manifold gauge set, with as short of hoses as possible on each of the temporary valves. Once again, the combustible gas leak detector may briefly go off. Wait for your meter to level off, then proceed with the repair. To remove the refrigerant from the system, you can open up both the high and low side lines and release the refrigerant slowly into the atmosphere. Doing this will more than likely set the combustible gas meter off. You should immediately shut off both valves on your manifold and allow any released R-290 refrigerant to dissipate in the atmosphere. Once the combustible gas meter levels off, you can continue to release R-290 refrigerant, repeating this process until all the refrigerant has been released from the refrigeration system. Once the refrigerant is out of the system, the technician must use a tubing cutter to cut out any failed refrigeration component. The reason for this is to prevent any possible spread of contamination and for the overall safety factor. For this example, the technician will cut the compressor pull-out right where it brazes into the compressor. He would then cut the liquid line as it exits the dryer. If the technician is replacing the compressor, he will cut the compressor discharge line right as it exits the compressor instead of the liquid line as it exits the dryer. Once the condensing unit has been removed, you will set the new condensing unit into place. Before pulling the plugs out of the compressor ports, be sure all of your refrigeration lines have been cleaned, pre-fitted, and are ready to be installed. This will minimize the amount of time the refrigeration system is open, which reduces the potential for any moisture to be absorbed into the compressor oil. When brazing on an R-290 system, you must always purge oxygen-free dry nitrogen through the system for a minimum of 2 minutes before and during brazing. We recommend you set the nitrogen regulator between 3 to 5 psig. Start to purge the nitrogen through the high side process tube, allowing it to exit out the suction process tube. You can now start to braze all of the joints. Once all brazing is done and the solder joints have cooled, pressurize the system with no more than 200 psig of oxygen-free dry nitrogen to leak check. Once we know that there are no leaks, you're ready to evacuate the refrigeration system. Release the nitrogen charge down to about 2 pounds of nitrogen pressure to ensure that no outside air is being drawn into the refrigeration system. Connect your charge hose to your micron gauge that should have already been connected to your vacuum pump. Start pulling a vacuum as soon as possible to help remove any moisture from the system. Continue to pull a vacuum until you reach a minimum of 500 microns. Once you reach 500 microns, you will want to close off the shutoff valve on the charging hose as well as the high and low side lines on your manifold gauges. Remove the charging hose going to your micron gauge. Place the adapter valve on the 1-pound R-290 cylinder. Be sure to leave the R-290 cylinder in its box. Then attach your charging hose to the R-290 adapter valve. Place the cylinder in the box on its side on the charging scale. Open up the tank valve, then bleed the charging hose. We recommend placing something heavy on top of your charging hose so that if the hose gets pulled, it will not affect the scale. Zero out the scale. Open up the shutoff valve on the charging hose. R-290 can be added as a liquid or a vapor. Open up the high side valve until the desired charge has been weighed in, then close the valve. If the system didn't take its full charge, close the high side valve and start the compressor and allow it to run for a minute. Then slowly open the low side valve until fully charged. Once the system is fully charged, close the adapter valve on the R-290 cylinder as well as the shutoff valve on the charging hose. Allow the unit to run to verify operation. It is now time to remove both your hoses and temporary access valves. True requires the removal of any access valves on any refrigeration system. The next step would be to remove the refrigerant that is trapped in the high side hose to assure that we have the proper charge in the unit. To do this, pinch off the high side process tube in front of the access port. Next, you want to open up the high side valve, then slowly open the low side manifold valve to draw all the refrigerant out of the high side hose. Once the pressures have equalized, you can close the high and low side manifolds. Using a tubing cutter, cut the high side process line in front of the temporary access valve and behind the pinch off tool. This could cause the combustible leak detector to go off. Wait for the combustible gas leak detector to level off before moving on. Be sure to crimp the end of the copper tube down so that it will make it easier to weld. Test the end of the line with the bubble to make sure it's not leaking. Once the combustible gas leak detector levels off, you're ready to braze the end of the process tube shut. Once the process tube cools down, remove the pinch-off tool and thoroughly leak check with soap bubbles. Now you can repeat these steps for the low side process tube. Once the final repair is completed, if the red identifying process tube sleeves have been removed, they must be reinstalled once the process tubes have cooled down. If you have any questions prior to working on an R-290 system, stop and contact True's Technical Service Department at 1-855-372-1368 or 1-800-325-6152.